came to the Arctic Circle because the money was impossible to ignore. Remote mining operations paid more in a season than most people earned in 2 years, and he needed that money desperately. Student loans, medical bills, a family situation that had spiraled beyond control. The details did not matter now. What mattered was that he signed a contract with Boreal Extraction Industries for a winter rotation at Site 17, a mineral excavation outpost located 200 kilometers north of the Svalbard archipelago. The recruitment video had been slick and professional. Smiling workers in clean coveralls, modern facilities with gym equipment and satellite internet, hot meals prepared by professional chefs, counselors available for mental health support. The video mentioned the polar night only briefly, describing it as an interesting natural phenomenon that crews would experience together. It made the darkness sound romantic, like watching a perpetual sunset. Nobody mentioned what the darkness actually did to people. He flew into Longyearbyen in late October, just as the sun began its final descent. From there, a helicopter carried him and 5 other new workers across a landscape of impossible whiteness, broken only by jagged mountain peaks that looked like broken teeth. The helicopter pilot wore dark glasses despite the dim light and did not speak except to warn them about turbulence. The flight took 90 minutes, and with each passing kilometer, the civilization of Longyearbyen fell further behind, until there was only ice and rock and sky. Site 17 appeared suddenly through the gloom, a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounding the dark mouth of a mine entrance. Floodlights blazed around the perimeter, creating an island of harsh illumination in the growing darkness. As the helicopter descended, he could see figures moving between buildings, their shadows long and distorted. The rotor wash kicked up clouds of snow that swirled like living things in the floodlights. The site manager met them on the landing pad. Her name was Peterson, and she had the weathered face of someone who had spent many seasons in the Arctic. She wore a heavy parka with the Boreal Extraction Industries logo on the breast, and her eyes were hidden behind darkened glasses despite the permanent twilight. She did not smile as she welcomed them. The first thing she did after the helicopter lifted off was hand each of them a laminated card. The card was small enough to fit in a pocket, printed on both sides with dense text in red ink. At the top, in larger letters, it read rules for winter operations. Peterson told them to keep the card with them at all times. She told them the rules were not suggestions. She told them that every person who had violated the rules had either been evacuated for psychological reasons or had died. He read the card while the other new workers shuffled nervously in the cold. There were 17 rules. Some seemed like common sense. Some seemed strange. A few seemed impossible to follow. Rule 1 stated that no worker should be outside alone after the noon hour. The The Arctic day was already short and growing shorter, but something about the specific mention of noon seemed significant. Peterson explained that this was when the psychological effects of the polar night were strongest. Even though there was still a faint glow on the horizon at noon, something about that specific hour made people vulnerable to mistakes in judgment. Rule 2 stated that if he heard someone calling his name from outside the buildings, he should verify that person's location before responding. He should never follow a voice into the darkness without confirming the caller's physical presence with at least one other witness. Rule 3 stated that shadows in the floodlights sometimes moved independently of the objects casting them. This was a known phenomenon. Workers should not acknowledge these movements, should not point them out, and should not attempt to photograph or study them. Acknowledgement made them worse. Rule 4 stated that the mine tunnels extended 3 kilometers into the permafrost, but workers were not permitted beyond the 2-kilometer mark. The deeper sections were closed due to structural concerns, and any worker who entered those sections would be immediately evacuated regardless of their reasoning. Rule 5 stated that if the floodlights suddenly failed, workers should immediately return to the residential building and lock themselves in their quarters until the lights were restored. They should not attempt to repair the lights themselves. They should not investigate the cause of the failure. They should wait in darkness until the emergency generators engaged, or until Peterson came to fetch them personally. Rule 6 stated that the recreational building was off limits between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. No exceptions. Even if he saw someone inside during those hours, even if he heard sounds of activity, he should not enter. He should report the incident to Peterson in the morning. Rule 7 stated that if he found himself disoriented or lost between buildings, despite the floodlights and clear paths, he should stand still and wait for help. He should not try to find his way back. The whiteout conditions and reflecting snow could create spatial confusion even in clear weather, and attempting to navigate while disoriented led to exposure deaths. Rule 8 stated that drinking water came from melted ice processed through a purification system in the main building. Workers should never melt and drink snow or ice from outside the designated collection area. The ice outside contained something that made people sick, though Peterson did not specify what. Rule 9 stated that all workers must maintain regular sleep schedules using artificial lighting and blackout curtains. The continuous darkness made the body's circadian rhythm collapse, leading to severe psychological disturbance. Workers who failed to maintain their sleep schedules would be evaluated and possibly removed from the site. Rule 10 stated that if he saw the aurora borealis displaying colors other than green, blue, or purple, he should immediately return inside and inform Peterson. Red auroras were particularly significant and required immediate reporting. Rule 11 stated that conversations with home via satellite phone should be kept brief and factual. Extended emotional conversations increased homesickness and psychological vulnerability. The site had a counselor available for mental health support, and workers should use those resources instead of burdening family members. Rule 12 stated that workers should stay together in groups of at least 3 when outside. If someone in the group began acting strangely, speaking incoherently, or suggesting unsafe actions, the other 2 should escort that person inside immediately and report to Peterson. Rule 13 stated that any wildlife spotted near the site should be reported immediately. Polar bears were rare this far north in winter, but not impossible. However, if the wildlife appeared to be watching the site or following workers, this was significant and required elevated security protocols. Rule 14 stated that workers should not discuss their dreams with each other. The polar night caused vivid nightmares in many people, and sharing these dreams created a cascade effect where others began experiencing similar visions. Dreams were private and should remain that way. Rule 15 stated that the temperature alarm would sound if the interior of any building dropped below freezing. If this happened, workers should gather in the residential building dining area and wait for maintenance to restore heat. They should not attempt to repair heating systems themselves, as this had led to carbon monoxide deaths in previous seasons. Rule 16 stated that if he encountered another worker standing motionless and unresponsive, staring at nothing, he should not touch that person or attempt to wake them. He should immediately get Peterson. These episodes were psychological and required professional intervention. Rule 17 stated that when the sun returned in February, workers would experience a psychological phenomenon called polar euphoria. This manifested as excessive risk-taking, poor judgment, and emotional volatility. Workers experiencing these symptoms should be monitored closely, as the return of the sun could be as dangerous as its absence. After reading the rules, he had questions, but Peterson was already walking toward the buildings, and the other new workers were following. The cold was brutal despite his heavy clothing, and he hurried to catch up, clutching the laminated card in his gloved hand. The residential building was warm and bright, almost aggressively so. Banks of full-spectrum lights lined the ceilings, creating an artificial daylight that hurt his eyes after the darkness outside. The building contained sleeping quarters, a dining area, recreation space, and bathroom facilities. His room was small but functional, with a firm bed, a desk, a chair, and blackout curtains that could seal the single window completely. Peterson told him to keep those curtains closed, except for the designated wake hours between 8 in the morning and 10 at night. She told him the artificial light schedule was mandatory, and that violations would result in immediate psychological evaluation. Dinner that first night was in the communal dining area. The food was good, far better than the dried rations he had expected. There were 23 people at Site 17, including himself and the other new arrivals. Most of the workers were men, though there were 4 women, including Peterson. The conversation was muted, and he noticed that several workers wore the same darkened glasses that Peterson favored. Even inside, under the bright lights, he sat next to a man named Victor, who had been at the site for 6 weeks. Victor was from Estonia and had worked in mines across Scandinavia for most of his adult life. When asked about the rules, Victor's expression darkened. He said the rules existed because people died when they ignored them. He said the Arctic was not like other places, and the polar night did things to human perception that science could not fully explain. He said that in 2 more weeks, the sun would set for the last time until February, and then the real darkness would begin. Someone else at the table, a Canadian woman named Chen, told Victor to stop scaring the new workers, but her tone was not reassuring. She had been at Site 17 for 3 months, since August, and she had experienced the transition from summer midnight sun to autumn twilight to the approaching polar night. She said the first few weeks were the hardest, that the mind resisted the absence of normal day and night, but that people adapted. She said the rules were important, but not supernatural. She said everything had a rational explanation, even if that explanation was not immediately obvious. He wanted to believe her, but something about the way the veteran workers moved, the way they constantly checked the windows, the way they never quite relaxed, even in the bright dining area, told him that rational explanations might not be enough. Work began the next morning at 8, after a breakfast of coffee, porridge, and dried fruit. The mine operation was exactly what the recruitment materials had promised: a professional extraction of rare earth minerals from a rich vein discovered 3 years earlier. The work was hard, physical, and dangerous in the normal ways that mining was dangerous. Cave-ins, equipment failures, toxic dust, diesel fumes, the cold that seeped through every layer of clothing and made metal tools painful to touch. But there were other dangers that the recruitment materials had not mentioned. The mine tunnels were lit by strings of LED lamps every 10 meters, creating pools of harsh white light separated by stretches of shadow. The deeper sections, past the 2-kilometer mark that Rule 4 prohibited, were completely dark. He could see the barrier that marked the boundary, a chain link fence with warning signs in multiple languages. Beyond that fence, the tunnel continued into blackness, and he could hear sounds from that darkness. Dripping water, shifting rock, sometimes something that might have been breathing. He asked his supervisor, a Norwegian man named Haverson, why the deep sections were closed. Haverson said there had been problems with structural stability, and that the company had decided the risk was not worth the potential mineral yield. But when he pressed, asking what kind of problems, Haverson's face closed off, and he repeated that workers should not go past the 2-kilometer mark under any circumstances. On his third day, one of the other new workers, a young German man named Klaus, disappeared during a shift change. Klaus had been complaining about the cold and the darkness, saying that he had made a mistake and wanted to leave. Peterson had told him to wait until the next supply helicopter in 2 weeks. That evening, Klaus was not at dinner. A search found him in the deep section of the mine, past the barrier, standing in the darkness without a light. When they brought him back, he was hypothermic and incoherent, babbling about voices that had called his name, about seeing lights moving in the deep tunnel, about something that had promised him warmth and safety if he would only follow. Klaus was evacuated 2 days later when the next helicopter arrived with supplies. Peterson said he had experienced an acute psychological episode brought on by rapid onset polar night adjustment disorder. She said it happened sometimes, especially with younger workers who had never experienced prolonged darkness. She said this was why the screening process was supposed to be rigorous, though clearly it had failed in Klaus's case. After Klaus left, the remaining workers became more careful about following the rules. He noticed that people always moved in groups of 3 or more outside, that nobody went near the recreational building between midnight and 4 in the morning, that when someone heard their name called, they stopped and looked around carefully before responding. The sun set for the last time on November 4th. He stood outside with a dozen other workers and watched the last sliver of light disappear below the southern horizon. The temperature was 30 below zero, and the wind cut through his parka like knives. But nobody wanted to be inside for that final sunset. Peterson stood with them, her expression unreadable behind her dark glasses. When the sun disappeared, something changed. The quality of the darkness was different. The floodlights seemed dimmer, though their output had not changed. The shadows seemed deeper. The wind carried sounds that might have been voices, or might have been only the wind. He felt an immediate surge of anxiety, a primal fear of the dark that he had not experienced since childhood. That night, he dreamed of the mine tunnels. In the dream, he walked past the 2-kilometer barrier into the deep sections. The darkness was absolute, but somehow he could still see. The tunnel walls were covered in frost that glittered like stars, and the ice formations created shapes that looked almost like writing. He heard voices speaking in a language he did not recognize, and when he turned to go back, the tunnel behind him was gone. There was only more darkness, stretching endlessly in all directions. He woke gasping, his heart hammering. The artificial daylight in his room was still on, set to simulate morning. His clock said it was 6:30. He had slept through the night, but he felt exhausted, as if he had been running for hours. He remembered Rule 14 about not discussing dreams, and he kept the nightmare to himself during breakfast. Victor was not at breakfast. Someone said he had reported feeling ill and was resting in his quarters, but when Peterson checked on him, Victor was gone. His room was empty, his bed unmade, his parka still hanging on its hook. A search of the compound found him in the recreational building, sitting in the dark in the common room, staring at the wall. When they turned on the lights, Victor did not react. His eyes were open, but he did not blink or respond to questions. This was Rule 16. Peterson had told them not to touch someone in this state, but one of the workers, panicking, grabbed Victor's shoulder and shook him. Victor began screaming, a sound so raw and terrified that it made everyone step back. He thrashed and fought, his eyes wild, shouting in Estonian about something in the tunnels, about lights that moved without source, about being watched. They restrained him, and Peterson sedated him with an injection from the medical kit. Victor spent the rest of the day unconscious in his quarters, and when he woke that evening, he had no memory of the episode. He said he remembered going to bed after dinner, and then nothing, until waking up with Peterson sitting beside him. He did not remember going to the recreational building. He did not remember what he had seen or why he had been screaming. Peterson increased the mandatory counseling sessions after that. Every worker was required to meet with the site psychologist, a quiet Finnish man named Virtanen, once every 3 days. During his first session, Virtanen asked him about his sleep quality, his appetite, his mood. He answered honestly that he was sleeping poorly and experiencing vivid nightmares, but that he felt mentally stable and capable of working. Virtanen nodded and made notes. He said that 90% of workers experienced sleep disturbances and nightmares during the polar night. He said the important thing was maintaining the artificial light schedule and staying socially engaged with the other workers. He said isolation was the real danger, that humans were not meant to exist in continuous darkness, and that the mind began creating its own stimuli when deprived of normal environmental input. He asked Virtanen about the shadows that moved independently of their sources, the phenomenon mentioned in Rule 3. Virtanen's expression became carefully neutral. He said that the combination of extreme cold, reflective snow, and artificial lighting created unusual optical effects that could appear unusual. He said the human brain was wired to detect motion and faces, and in low light conditions with high contrast, the brain sometimes perceived movement where none existed. He said the important thing was not to fixate on these phenomena, as fixation led to anxiety, and anxiety led to more perceptual disturbances. This seemed like a reasonable explanation, but it did not explain why the rule specifically stated not to acknowledge the movements, not to point them out, not to study them. It did not explain the phrase that acknowledgement made them worse. 2 weeks into the polar night, he saw what the rule meant. He was walking from the residential building to the mine entrance with Chen and another worker named Dmitri. The floodlights were blazing as always, creating stark pools of illumination across the snow. he happened to glance at his own shadow and noticed that it was not quite aligned with his body. When he stopped walking, the shadow continued for 2 more steps before stopping. When he turned his head, the shadow turned a moment later, as if it were slightly delayed, slightly out of sync. He almost said something. He almost pointed it out to Chen and Dimitri. But he remembered Rule 3, and he kept quiet. He watched his shadow peripherally as they walked, and he saw that the delay was growing worse. By the time they reached the mine entrance, his shadow was moving independently, gesturing in ways that did not match his movements, sometimes splitting into multiple shadows that overlapped and merged. Inside the mine, under the different lighting, the phenomenon stopped. His shadow behaved normally, but he felt watched, studied, as if something had noticed his attention and was now aware of him. That night, he violated Rule 14. He told Chen about what he had seen, about the shadow that had moved wrong. Chen's face went pale. She said she had experienced the same thing, that her shadow sometimes acted independently, but that she had followed the rule and not acknowledged it. She said that since she had kept quiet, the phenomenon had stopped after a few days. She said that by telling her, by discussing it, he had made a mistake. She was right. Over the next week, the shadow problem got worse. Not just his shadow, but shadows cast by equipment, by buildings, by the mine entrance itself. The shadows moved when nothing was moving them. They stretched and contracted regardless of light source position. Sometimes they appeared to interact with each other, shadows reaching toward shadows, merging and separating in ways that made his head hurt to watch. Other workers were experiencing it too. He could tell by the way they avoided looking at the ground, by the way they kept their eyes fixed straight ahead when walking between buildings. Nobody discussed it, following Rule 14, but the knowledge was shared in glances and careful movements. Peterson called a mandatory meeting. She stood before the assembled workers in the dining area and acknowledged that some people were experiencing increased perceptual disturbances. She said this was normal for the middle period of the polar night, when the darkness was absolute and the mind was most vulnerable. She said the phenomena would pass if people followed the rules and maintained their mental health routines. She said that evacuation was always an option for anyone who felt they could not continue, but that evacuations were expensive and would likely result in the worker not being invited back for future rotations. Nobody volunteered to leave. The money was too good, and everyone had reasons for being there that went beyond simple employment. Work in the mine became increasingly strange. The LED lights in the tunnels began flickering brief interruptions that left afterimages burned into his vision. Sometimes he saw movement in the periphery, shapes that darted between the pools of light too quickly to focus on. The sounds from the deep section grew louder, more varied. No longer just dripping water and settling rock, but sounds that resembled machinery or conversation or music played at a frequency just below hearing. Haverson told the workers to stay in groups and to maintain constant communication. He issued high-powered flashlights to everyone and said that if the tunnel lights failed completely, they were to evacuate immediately and let maintenance investigate. He said this with the same neutral tone that everyone used when discussing the rules, a tone that suggested more knowledge than was being shared. One morning, Chen did not show up for breakfast. Her room was empty, her bed made. No sign of struggle or distress. A search of the compound found her standing outside in the darkness between the residential building and the mine entrance, wearing only her thermal underwear, barefoot in the snow. The temperature was 40 below zero. She should have been dead within minutes. But Chen was not dead. She was not even shivering. She stood perfectly still, facing the mine entrance, her breath visible in the floodlights. When they called her name, she did not respond. When they approached, she turned to look at them, and her eyes were completely black, pupils dilated so far that no iris was visible. They wrapped her in blankets and carried her inside. Peterson examined her and found no signs of frostbite despite her bare feet and minimal clothing. Chen's core temperature was normal. Her vital signs were stable, but she would not speak, would not respond to questions, would not explain how she had gotten outside or why. Vertinen sedated her and kept her under observation. When she woke 12 hours later, she remembered nothing after going to bed the previous night. She did not remember getting up. She did not remember going outside. She did not remember standing in the killing cold, wearing almost nothing. Peterson increased the security protocols. Motion sensors were installed around all buildings. Workers were required to check in hourly via radio when outside. The recreational building was locked entirely, not just during the prohibited hours. The medical supplies were inventoried, and Vertinen began keeping a closer watch on everyone's mental state. But the incidents continued. Dmitri was found in the mine tunnels at 3 a.m, naked, trying to dig through the rock wall with his bare hands. His fingers were bloody, several nails torn off, but he claimed to feel no pain. He said something had told him there was a passage behind the rock, a shortcut to somewhere important, and he had to find it. Another worker, a Swedish woman named Lindqvist, began speaking in a language nobody recognized. She would be working normally, operating equipment or moving materials, and suddenly she would stop and begin reciting what sounded like poetry or scripture in flowing, rhythmic syllables that had no correspondence to any known language. When it passed, she would resume working as if nothing had happened, with no memory of the episode. The nightmares became universal. Every worker reported dreams of the mine tunnels, of the deep section beyond the barrier, of voices calling them into darkness. Some dreamed of a light that moved through the tunnels, a cold blue glow that revealed impossible architecture, chambers, and passages that should not exist. Some dreamed of figures standing in the darkness, watching silently, waiting for something. He stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. The artificial day-night cycle meant nothing to his body anymore. He felt perpetually jet-lagged, his sense of time completely unmoored. He worked his shifts in a fog of exhaustion, operating equipment by muscle memory, speaking to others, but not really hearing their words. During a shift in the mine, 3 weeks into the polar night, the tunnel lights failed. One moment he was working with Haverson and 2 others, drilling into the rock face, and the next moment everything went dark. Not just dim, but absolutely black, a darkness so complete that he could not see his hand in front of his face. Rule 5. Return to the residential building immediately. Lock themselves in quarters. Wait for restoration or for Peterson to come personally. He fumbled for his flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness, revealing the tunnel walls, the equipment, the faces of his coworkers. They looked frightened, but controlled. Haverson said they needed to get back to the surface, that emergency generators should engage within 5 minutes, but that they should not wait. They started walking back toward the entrance, moving carefully, sweeping their flashlights ahead. But something was wrong with the tunnel. The distances were not right. They walked for what felt like 15 minutes, far longer than it should have taken to reach the entrance, and they were still surrounded by tunnel walls. Haverson stopped. He said they must have gotten turned around, that they should retrace their steps. But when they turned around, the tunnel behind them looked identical to the tunnel ahead. The lead light strings were dead in both directions, and without those markers, there was no way to orient themselves. One of the other workers, a young Norwegian named Søren, began to panic. He said they were lost, that the tunnel had changed, that they needed to run. Haverson grabbed him and told him to breathe, to stay calm, that they would figure it out. But Søren twisted away and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he fled into the darkness. They chased him, shouting his name, and the tunnel filled with echoes that made it impossible to determine which direction the sounds were coming from. His flashlight began to dim, the battery dying despite being fully charged that morning. The other flashlights were fading too, and in the growing darkness, he saw movement. Shapes in the tunnel that were not human. They moved along the walls and ceiling, flowing like water, leaving trails of frost wherever they touched. They made no sound, but he could feel them, a pressure in his head, a presence that pushed against his thoughts. Haverson saw them too. He whispered for everyone to stop moving, to stand still, to not acknowledge what they were seeing. Rule 3. Do not acknowledge. Do not point out. Do not study. They stood frozen in the dimming flashlight beams while the shapes moved around them. He could see them more clearly now, forms that suggested limbs and faces, but were not quite either, geometries that hurt to look at, angles that should not exist in 3-dimensional space. They circled the workers, coming closer, and the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on his clothes, on his exposed skin, inside his nose when he breathed. Then, from deeper in the tunnel, he heard Soren screaming, not words, just raw terror. A sound that went on and on until it cut off suddenly, leaving only silence. The shapes withdrew. The temperature rose slightly. The flashlight beams steadied, though they were still dim. Haverson said they needed to move now, and they ran. They ran without knowing which direction was right. Ran until they saw a light ahead, warm and yellow, the entrance to the mine. They burst out into the compound, gasping, and found Peterson waiting with a dozen other workers. The floodlights were back on, blazing across the snow. She asked where Soren was, and Haverson said they had gotten separated, that Soren had panicked and run, that they had heard him scream. A search party went into the mine with powerful spotlights and radio equipment. They searched for 8 hours, combing every tunnel, every chamber, every dead end. They found no sign of Soren. No body, no blood, no torn clothing. He had simply vanished into the darkness. Peterson declared the mine temporarily closed, while maintenance investigated the power failure, and the tunnel geometry was remapped. But privately, she told the workers that the mine had done this before, that it had a way of taking people, and that Soren would not be the last to disappear if they were not more careful. The days after Soren's disappearance were the worst. With the mine closed, there was no work to distract from the darkness, no routine to impose structure on the endless night. Workers stayed in the residential building, huddled under the artificial lights, but the lights provided no real comfort. Everyone knew that the darkness was outside, waiting, and that eventually they would have to go back into it. Chen recovered enough to work again, but she was different. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were careful, measured, as if she were translating from some other language. She avoided windows and would not go outside, even in a group of 3. She spent hours in her room with the door locked, and sometimes he heard her crying. He asked Vertinen if people were evacuated when they broke down, if there was a point at which the company acknowledged that someone could not continue. Vertinen said that evacuations happened, but that the decision was not based on emotional state alone. Workers had to represent a danger to themselves or others before emergency evacuation was authorized. Otherwise, they waited for the scheduled supply helicopter, which came every 2 weeks. The next helicopter was not due for 8 more days. He did not think he could last 8 more days. The mine reopened after 4 days of maintenance. The power failure was attributed to a frozen fuel line that had stopped the generators. The tunnel geometry was declared unchanged, and the disappearance of Soren was officially attributed to disorientation and hypothermia. His body would likely be found when the snow melted in spring. Nobody believed the official explanation, but nobody argued. They went back to work because there was nothing else to do. Work continued for 2 more weeks without major incident. The shadows still moved wrong. The sounds from the deep section still echoed up the tunnels. Workers still had nightmares and experienced episodes of lost time, but nobody else disappeared. And slowly, a new routine established itself. Then the floodlights failed. All of them simultaneously, at noon, exactly as specified in Rule 5. One moment the compound was illuminated, harsh and bright against the snow, and the next moment it was completely dark. Not twilight, but absolute darkness, the kind that existed in deep caves or at the bottom of oceans. He was in the dining area when it happened. The artificial lights inside the building stayed on, powered by a different system, but looking out the windows was like looking into a void. Nothing reflected. Nothing was visible. It was as if the world outside had simply ceased to exist. Peterson came on the intercom and repeated Rule 5. All workers were to return to their quarters immediately and lock their doors. They were to remain there until the lights were restored, or until she came for them personally. Her voice was tight with stress, and when someone asked what was happening, she did not answer. He went to his room and locked the door as instructed. He could hear others in the hallway, nervous conversations, someone crying. He sat on his bed and tried to read, tried to do anything to occupy his mind, but he found himself staring at the window instead. The blackout curtains were closed, but there were gaps at the edges, and through those gaps, he could see the darkness outside. It was not empty darkness. It was full of movement, shapes that pressed against the window, faces that were not quite faces looking in. He heard scratching on the glass, soft at first, then harder, as if something were trying to get in. Rule 5 said to wait in his quarters. It did not say what to do if something tried to break in. The scratching continued for hours. Sometimes it stopped, and he would begin to relax. And then it would resume, harder and more insistent. He heard it at other windows too, heard workers shouting in other rooms, heard running footsteps in the hallway. Then the artificial lights inside the building began to flicker. The full spectrum LEDs dimmed and brightened randomly, creating a strobe effect that made his head pound. In the flickering light, his shadow on the wall moved independently again. But this time, it was not just delayed. It was doing things he was not doing. Reaching, gesturing, turning to look at him. He closed his eyes and counted, trying to stay calm, trying to follow the rules. The darkness and isolation were causing perceptual disturbances. This was known. This was expected. He needed to maintain control. The door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. He heard breathing on the other side of the door, rapid and harsh. A voice called his name, but it was not a voice he recognized. It sounded like his name spoken backwards, or underwater, or by something that had heard human speech, but never quite learned to replicate it correctly. Rule 2: verify location before responding to your name. Do not follow voices without confirmation. He did not answer. He did not open the door. He sat on his bed in the flickering light, while something on the other side of the door tried to convince him to let it in. Hours passed. Maybe 6, maybe 10. Time had no meaning in the darkness. Eventually, the flickering stopped, and the lights returned to normal. The scratching at the window ceased. The voice at the door went silent. He heard Peterson in the hallway, calling for workers to unlock their doors, saying that the emergency was over. He opened his door carefully. Peterson stood in the hallway with Haverson and 2 other workers, all of them carrying flashlights and radios. Her face was drawn, exhausted. She asked if he was all right, and he nodded, not trusting his voice. Other doors opened. Workers emerged looking shaken. Chen was bleeding from her hands, where she had apparently clawed at her own door, trying to get out. Dmitri was unconscious in his room, and Vertinen had to revive him with smelling salts. Lindqvist was speaking in that unknown language again, a steady stream of syllables that sounded like praying or pleading. 3 workers were missing. They had not locked themselves in their quarters as instructed. Peterson found them in the recreational building, which was supposed to be locked. They were sitting in the common room in the dark, facing each other in a triangle, not moving, not speaking. When Peterson turned on the lights, they continued sitting motionless, their eyes open but unseeing. Vertinen tried to wake them using the same techniques that had worked on Victor and Chen, but these 3 did not respond. They remained frozen, barely breathing, their eyes fixed on something invisible in the center of their triangle. Their core temperatures were dropping despite the warm building, and their pulses were growing weaker. Peterson made the decision to evacuate them immediately. She radioed for an emergency helicopter, requesting medical evacuation for 3 workers experiencing severe hypothermia and unresponsive psychological states. The helicopter company said they would come at first light, which was not actually light, but the least dark part of the perpetual night, the hours around noon, when the southern horizon showed a faint glow. The 3 workers died before the helicopter arrived. They simply stopped breathing, one after another, over the course of 2 hours. Vertinen tried CPR, tried every intervention in the medical kit, but their hearts would not restart. They died sitting in their triangle, their eyes still open, still staring at nothing. The helicopter came and took the bodies. It also took 5 other workers who had reached their breaking points and demanded immediate evacuation regardless of the cost. That left 12 people at Site 17, barely half the number that had started the winter rotation. Peterson called a meeting. She stood before the remaining workers and acknowledged that the situation had exceeded normal parameters. She said that Boreal Extraction Industries was aware of the difficulties and was considering shutting down the site for the remainder of the polar night. She said a decision would be made within 48 hours and that everyone should prepare for possible evacuation. But 48 hours passed and no decision came. The satellite communications were experiencing interference, bursts of static that made radio contact with the outside world difficult. Peterson spent hours trying to get through to company headquarters, but the messages that came back were fragmented and unclear. Meanwhile, conditions at the site continued to deteriorate. The mine was closed again after 2 workers reported seeing movement in the deep section beyond the barrier. Shapes that approached the fence and pressed against it, as if testing its strength. The recreational building remained locked, but workers reported hearing sounds from inside, furniture moving, voices speaking in multiple languages. Rule 10 specified reporting auroras with unusual colors, particularly red. On the 53rd day of the polar night, he saw what the rule meant. He was outside with Haverson and Chen, moving between buildings when the sky lit up. Not the usual green curtains of the aurora borealis, but waves of deep crimson that pulsed and flowed like blood in water. The red light cast everything in shades of rust and shadow, and in that light, he saw that the snow around the compound was not white, but covered in dark stains, as if something had bled across the entire area. Haverson whispered that they needed to get inside immediately. They ran for the residential building, and behind them, the red aurora intensified. He heard sounds in that light, not wind, but something like singing. Voices that harmonized in ways that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Inside, Peterson saw the red light through the windows and immediately initiated lockdown protocols. All exterior doors were sealed. Windows were covered with blackout curtains. Workers were confined to the residential building until the aurora passed. The red light lasted for 6 hours. During that time, the building shook repeatedly, as if something enormous were moving around outside. The temperature inside dropped despite the heating system running at full capacity. Frost formed on interior walls. Water in cups froze solid. Workers huddled together in the dining area, sharing body heat, while Peterson monitored the radio and Vertinen distributed emergency rations. When the red aurora finally faded and the normal darkness returned, Peterson cautiously checked the exterior. The compound looked different. The buildings were in the same positions, but the snow had been disturbed, marked with enormous depressions like footprints. Though the shape was wrong, too many points of contact, too much weight distributed strangely. The mine entrance had collapsed. Not a small rockfall, but a total structural failure. Tons of ice and rock blocking the shaft completely. Haverson examined the collapse and said it would take weeks to clear with proper equipment, and that attempting to do so in polar night conditions would be suicidal. Without the mine operational, there was no reason for Site 17 to remain active. Peterson made the decision to evacuate the remaining workers as soon as weather permitted helicopter flight. She sent an emergency message via satellite, requesting immediate extraction for 12 personnel due to site compromise. response came back fragmented, pieces of words interrupted by static. Something about weather conditions, something about waiting for clearance, something about reassessment of site status. Nothing concrete, nothing that promised rescue. Peterson tried again and again to establish clear communication, but each attempt resulted in the same broken transmissions. It was as if something were interfering with the signal, breaking up the words, inserting silence where answers should have been. On the 58th day of the polar night, Haverson broke. He had been quieter than usual for several days, spending more time alone in his quarters, skipping meals. When he finally emerged, his eyes had that same vacant quality that Victor and Chen had displayed during their episodes. He walked past the other workers without acknowledging them, went to the supply closet, and began packing cold weather gear into a backpack. Peterson asked him what he was doing. Haverson said he was leaving. He said he had figured it out, that the rescue was not coming because they did not want anyone to leave, that the only way out was to walk. He said it was 200 kilometers back to Longyearbyen, but that he had enough supplies for the journey, and that the walking would keep him warm. Peterson tried to reason with him. 200 kilometers in polar night conditions, with temperatures averaging 40 below zero, was certain death. Even if he could maintain the correct bearing, which was nearly impossible in continuous darkness, he would freeze or fall into a crevasse, or simply exhaust himself and collapse in the snow. Haverson did not listen. He finished packing his gear, put on his parka and boots, and walked to the exterior door. Peterson physically blocked his path and ordered him to stop. Haverson shoved her aside with surprising strength and unlocked the door. He stepped out into the darkness, and the floodlights revealed his figure moving away from the compound, walking steadily toward the south. Several workers ran after him, calling his name, but he did not turn around. He walked until the darkness swallowed him, and then he was gone. They searched for him for 3 hours, sweeping the perimeter with flashlights and calling his name. They found his tracks in the snow, clear at first, then becoming erratic, wandering in circles. The tracks ended abruptly at the edge of a rocky outcropping. There was no sign of Haverson, no body at the base of the rocks, no blood, no torn clothing, just tracks that stopped as if he had stepped off the edge of the world. After that, Peterson instituted even stricter controls. All exterior doors were kept locked, keys held only by Peterson and Vertinen. Workers were required to check in verbally every 2 hours, even during sleep periods. Anyone showing signs of psychological deterioration was to be sedated and restrained if necessary, but the deterioration was not limited to individuals. The entire compound was changing. The buildings seemed to shift positions slightly when nobody was looking directly at them. The distances between structures varied, sometimes taking 30 steps to walk from the residential building to the storage shed, sometimes taking 60. The The floodlights created shadows that no longer corresponded to any physical object, dark shapes that moved across the snow with apparent purpose. The temperature inside the buildings began fluctuating, despite the heating systems running constantly. Some rooms became unbearably hot, forcing workers to strip down to thermal underwear. Other rooms became freezing, frost forming on walls and ceilings. The thermostats showed normal readings, but the actual conditions bore no relationship to the displayed numbers. Food began spoiling at impossible rates. Supplies that should have lasted weeks went rancid overnight. Frozen meat developed a strange phosphorescent quality, glowing faintly blue in darkness. Water tasted wrong, metallic, and bitter, despite coming from the same purification system that had worked perfectly for months. Dmitri and Lindqvist stopped speaking entirely. They communicated only in gestures and written notes, and the notes were increasingly incoherent, filled with symbols that resembled letters, but were not part of any alphabet. They worked their shifts mechanically, ate when food was placed in front of them, and spent their free hours sitting together in the recreation room, drawing elaborate diagrams on sheets of paper that they would not let anyone else examine. Chen disappeared on day 63. Her room was locked from the inside, but when they broke down the door, she was not there. The window was closed and sealed. There was no way out, yet Chen was gone, leaving behind only her clothes folded neatly on the bed, and a smell in the air like ozone and copper. Peterson stopped trying to maintain order after that. She gathered the remaining 8 workers in the dining area and told them the truth. Site 17 had been established 3 years earlier on the site of an abandoned research station from the Cold War era. The previous station had been evacuated suddenly in the winter of 1984. All personnel removed by military transport with no public explanation. Boreal Extraction Industries had acquired the land cheaply, assuming the evacuation had been related to political rather than environmental factors. But there had been reports workers during the first winter rotation had experienced the same phenomena. Shadows that moved wrong, spatial distortions, psychological episodes, disappearances. The company had attributed these events to the extreme isolation and darkness, had implemented the rules, had brought in counselors, and improved mental health protocols. The second winter rotation had fewer incidents. The third had fewer still. The company had believed the problem was solved, that proper preparation and rule following would prevent the worst outcomes. They had been wrong. This winter was worse than the first. Something about the polar night this year was different, more intense. Perhaps it was solar activity, or magnetic field fluctuations, or some other variable that science could not yet measure. Or perhaps the site itself had been getting stronger, learning, adapting to the presence of humans. Peterson said that rescue was not coming because helicopters could not fly in the current magnetic interference, the static on communications, was not weather-related, but caused by something at the site itself. They were trapped until the sun returned in February. Still 7 weeks away, one of the workers, a young woman named Sokolov, who had been silent through most of the winter, asked what they were supposed to do. Peterson said they needed to survive, follow the rules, stay together, wait for the sun. She said that previous workers had survived by maintaining discipline and not giving in to the psychological pressure. But even as she spoke, the lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and from somewhere in the building, they heard singing, that same wordless harmony they had heard under the red aurora, voices that came from no human throat. The next 2 weeks dissolved into survival mode. The workers barricaded themselves in the dining area, bringing in sleeping bags and portable heaters. They abandoned the rest of the residential building after finding frost covering entire walls and figures standing motionless in empty rooms, figures that vanished when approached, but returned when backs were turned. Food ran low. The supplies in storage had mostly spoiled, and what remained had to be carefully rationed. Water became scarce as the purification system failed, clogged with ice that should not have formed in the heated building. They melted snow despite Rule 8 because the alternative was dehydration, and they accepted whatever sickness might come from it. Dmitri died first. He simply stopped moving one evening, put down the spoon he had been using to eat soup, and ceased breathing. No convulsions, no distress, just a transition from alive to dead, as if he had switched off. Vertinen examined the body and found no cause of death. Heart still present, lungs intact, brain showing no signs of trauma. Dmitri was dead because he had decided to be dead, because his body had given up. They wrapped him in blankets and placed him in one of the abandoned rooms. There was no way to bury him in the frozen ground, and cremation was impossible without compromising their limited fuel. He would have to wait until spring, until someone came to investigate why Site 17 had stopped responding to communications. Lindqvist followed Dmitri 3 days later. The same way, no struggle or pain, just cessation. Then Sokolov. Then 2 others whose names he had stopped keeping track of because names no longer seemed to matter in the darkness. That left 4. Himself, Peterson, Vertinen, and Victor. 4 people in a barricaded room, surrounded by darkness and cold and things that moved in that darkness, waiting for a sun that might never rise. Peterson stopped sleeping. She sat by the door with a flashlight and a crowbar, watching for movement, listening for sounds. When he tried to convince her to rest, she said that something was testing the barricade, pushing against it, trying to find a way in. She said if she slept, it would get through. Vertinen spent his time writing. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, documenting everything that had happened, creating a record in case anyone ever found their bodies. He said it was important that people know that other workers not be sent to this place, that Site 17 be permanently closed and the land quarantined. Victor prayed. He had not been religious when the winter started, but now he knelt in his sleeping bag and recited prayers in Estonian, Russian, and broken English. He prayed to God, to old gods whose names sounded like wind and ice, to anything that might be listening in the darkness. Sometimes his prayers were answered by that wordless singing, and Victor would weep with terror or joy. It was impossible to tell which. On day 82 of the polar night, he noticed that the southern horizon was lighter, not by much, just a faint glow like distant city lights, but it was there. The sun was returning. Not for several more weeks, not visibly, but the astronomical twilight was beginning. The absolute darkness was ending. The change in light seemed to affect the phenomena. The shadows became less active. The spatial distortions lessened. The temperature inside the barricaded room stabilized. The sounds from the rest of the building quieted, and the sense of presence that had been pushing against their shelter withdrew slightly. Peterson allowed herself to sleep for the first time in days. She collapsed into her sleeping bag and was unconscious within seconds. Virtanen put down his pen and closed his notebooks. Victor stopped praying and instead began talking. Real conversation, asking about plans for when they got out, about what they would do with the money, about normal life in normal places with normal daylight, but the relief was temporary. On day 85, as the twilight grew fractionally stronger, Peterson woke screaming. She had dreamed of the deep section of the mine, of the tunnels beyond the 2-kilometer barrier, and in her dream she had seen what was down there, not creatures or monsters, but an absence, a void that consumed light and heat and life. She said it was waking up, drawn by the returning sun, and that when the sun finally rose above the horizon, the void would emerge. Virtanen told her it was only a dream, stress and exhaustion manifesting as nightmare. But Peterson insisted it was more than that. She said the dreams during polar night were not normal dreams, that they showed true things, and that her dream was a warning. She said they needed to leave immediately, not wait for rescue, not wait for the sun, but leave now while the darkness still provided some protection. He reminded her what had happened to Haverson. Walking to Longyearbyen was suicide. Peterson said staying was also suicide, just slower. She said at least walking gave them a chance, that maybe they would be found, that maybe the darkness would hide them from what was waking beneath the mine. Victor agreed with Peterson. He said he would rather die trying to escape than die waiting in a barricaded room. Virtanen was unsure, but eventually he nodded. They would try to walk out, all 4 of them together, following the rules as much as possible, even outside the compound. They spent a day preparing, packing every scrap of food, filling containers with melted snow, gathering cold, weather gear, and emergency supplies. They fashioned crude weapons from mining tools, though nobody could articulate what they thought they might need to fight. They studied the maps and plotted the most direct route south, acknowledging that navigation in darkness would be nearly impossible, but that they had to try. On day 87 of the polar night, they left Site 17. The floodlights were still burning, creating that island of harsh illumination against the darkness. They walked to the edge of the light and paused, looking back at the buildings, at the collapsed mine entrance, at the place that had been their prison for 3 months. Then they stepped into the darkness and began walking south. The first few hours were almost peaceful. They moved in a tight group, staying within arm's reach of each other, following the compass bearing. The snow was hard-packed and relatively flat, making progress easier than expected. The temperature was brutal, hovering around 45 below, but their gear was good, and their bodies had adapted to the cold over the long winter. But as they moved further from Site 17, the landscape began to change. The flat snow gave way to rough ice formations that jutted up like broken glass. The compass began spinning erratically. Unable to find magnetic north, the darkness became thicker, more substantial, pressing against them like water pressure. They heard things moving parallel to their path, not animals. The sounds were too regular, too purposeful. Footsteps that matched their pace, breathing that synchronized with their own. Sometimes they saw lights in the distance, blue and cold, that might have been aurora reflections, or might have been something else. Victor was the first to falter. He began falling behind, his steps becoming slower and less coordinated. When they stopped to help him, he said he was seeing things, figures walking alongside them, people he recognized from Site 17, the ones who had died or disappeared. He said they were calling to him, telling him to rest, promising that if he just lay down in the snow for a moment, he would feel better. They forced him to keep moving, supporting his weight between them, but he grew heavier with each step, as if gravity were increasing its hold on him. Eventually, he stopped walking entirely, and they realized he was dead, frozen upright between them, his eyes still open, his face peaceful. They had no choice but to leave him. They leaned his body against an ice formation and continued south. Peterson began having difficulty breathing. The cold air was damaging her lungs, each breath a knife of pain. She coughed blood into her scarf, but kept walking, determined not to stop, not to become like Victor. Vertinen was the calmest. He walked steadily, conserving his energy, helping support Peterson when she stumbled. He did not speak about what he saw or heard, did not acknowledge the lights, or the sounds, or the figures that seemed to walk just beyond their vision. He focused on the next step, and the next, and the next. As the hours passed, he lost track of time. Day had no meaning in the polar night, and his watch had stopped working, the battery drained by the cold. They walked through an endless present, no past to reference, no future to hope for, only the immediate moment of cold and darkness and motion. Then Peterson collapsed. She fell forward into the snow and did not get up. Vertinen knelt beside her and checked for vitals, then shook his head. She had died mid-step, her heart simply giving out. He said a few words over her body, something about bravery and sacrifice, but his voice was hoarse, and the words were carried away by the wind. That left two, himself and Vertinen. They looked at each other in the glow of their failing flashlights and acknowledged, without speaking, that neither of them would make it to Longyearbyen. They were going to die out here, and the only question was how far they could get before their bodies gave out. But Vertinen had one more idea. He pointed to the horizon, where the twilight glow was slightly stronger. He said that if they walked toward that light, toward the returning sun, maybe they would find something. Maybe the light would protect them. Maybe someone would see them against the brightening sky. They walked toward the light. The landscape became increasingly surreal. Ice formations that looked like buildings, like forests, like crowds of people, frozen mid-gesture. The wind carved sounds from the ice that resembled voices, music, machinery. The darkness behind them grew denser, as if Site 17's influence were pursuing them, unwilling to let them escape. Vertinen fell during what might have been the second day or the third day. He tripped on ice and broke his leg, a compound fracture that left bone protruding through his snow pants. He told him to keep going, to leave him, that one person had a better chance than two. But he refused. They had come this far together, and if they were going to die, it would be together. He fashioned a splint from tent poles and wrapped Vertinen's leg as well as he could with frozen fingers. Then he helped Vertinen stand, and they continued, moving much slower now, Vertinen gasping with pain at every step. The twilight grew stronger. The sky went from black to deep blue to pale violet. Stars became visible overhead, familiar constellations that meant the magnetic interference was weakening, and on the southern horizon, a line of color appeared, deep red fading to orange, the promise of the sun still below the horizon, but approaching. They walked toward that color. Hours passed, maybe a day. His sense of time had completely dissolved, but the color grew brighter, and eventually the sky overhead turned light blue, and he could see the landscape clearly for the first time in months. They were in a valley between mountains, surrounded by ice and rock and emptiness. There were no buildings, no roads, no signs of human presence. They were lost in the Arctic with a broken man and failing supplies. But there was light, real light, not artificial. The light of the sun diffused through atmosphere, even though the sun itself was still below the horizon, and in that light, the darkness could not follow. The pressure that had been pursuing them stopped at the edge of the twilight and withdrew, unable or unwilling to exist in even this pale illumination. Vertinen said they had made it. They had escaped Site 17. Even if they died out here, they had proven it was possible to leave, that the darkness did not have absolute power. He wrote a final note in his waterproof notebook, describing their escape, giving coordinates as best he could estimate them, explaining what had happened at Site 17, and warning future workers never to return. Then they sat down together on the ice to wait, either for rescue or for death, whichever came first. He must have passed out, because the next thing he remembered was noise. Helicopter rotors, voices shouting, hands lifting him, wrapping him in thermal blankets, loading him into a helicopter that smelled of diesel fuel and heated air. He tried to tell them about Vertinen, but someone was already attending to him, stabilizing his leg, checking his vitals, preparing him for transport. The helicopter rose into the pale sky, and he looked down at the Arctic landscape below, at the ice and mountains and darkness. And far to the north, barely visible against the twilight, he saw Site 17. The floodlights were still burning, but they seemed dimmer now, less substantial. The buildings looked smaller, almost abandoned. And surrounding the compound, spreading out across the snow in all directions, he saw shadows, not shadows cast by anything physical, but darkness that moved independently, darkness that had presence and purpose, and was slowly, inexorably, consuming the light. The helicopter pilot saw them too. He increased altitude and adjusted course, giving Site 17 a wide berth, and he did not speak about what he had seen. They flew to Longyearbyen, to the small hospital there, where doctors treated him for severe frostbite, malnutrition, and psychological trauma. Vertinen survived the flight and the initial treatment, but his damaged leg became infected and had to be amputated below the knee. The doctor said they were lucky to be alive, that walking over 200 kilometers in polar night conditions was virtually impossible, that their survival was miraculous. Boreal Extraction Industries sent representatives to interview them. They asked detailed questions about what had happened at Site 17, about the rules, about the phenomena they had witnessed. They took Vertinen's notebooks and said they would investigate thoroughly. 2 weeks later, the company released a statement. Site 17 had been permanently closed due to structural concerns with the mine and environmental factors that made year-round operation unsafe. All winter rotation programs in the high Arctic were suspended pending review of safety protocols. The families of the workers who had died were compensated generously, and non-disclosure agreements were signed as part of the settlement. Vertinen returned to Finland and never spoke publicly about Site 17. He wrote no books, gave no interviews, refused all contact with journalists. He simply returned to his life, though he walked with a cane now and never worked in remote locations again. He tried to return to normal life as well. He used the money from his contract to pay off his debts, to help his family, to start fresh. But the polar night had changed something fundamental in him. He could not tolerate complete darkness anymore. He slept with lights on, kept flashlights in every room, avoided windowless spaces. And sometimes, on winter nights when the sun set early, he looked at his shadow and saw it move wrong, saw it delay just slightly, saw it gesture in ways he was not gesturing. He still had the laminated card with the 17 rules. He kept it in his wallet as a reminder, not of what to do if he ever returned to the Arctic, because he knew he would never go back, but as a reminder that some places were not meant for human habitation. That darkness was not just absence of light, but a thing in itself, something with presence and purpose. That there were rules for survival, and breaking those rules had consequences that science could not explain and safety protocols could not prevent. He had survived Site 17. But in surviving, he had learned that the Arctic Circle held secrets deeper and darker than any mine shaft, phenomena that the long night revealed but did not cause. The darkness had always been there, waiting beneath the ice, and it would continue waiting long after human beings stopped trying to extract minerals from frozen ground. The sun had saved him, but the darkness never forgot, and sometimes, in those winter nights with shadows that moved wrong, he wondered if he had truly escaped it all, or if some part of him was still there, still walking through the darkness, still trying to find a light that never came.